When I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, or manic depression as it was back then, in 1993, I was told it was a chemical imbalance. And all of the treatment that I was offered was designed to address that imbalance. And what I've discovered in the last 33 years is that there is a huge psychological component to the bipolar that I experience, and I would imagine that a lot of people experience. And in this video, I'm going to talk about that and how I've addressed it and how I've really managed to change my relationship with bipolar by addressing those psychological aspects. So I hope you enjoy the video. For me, there's a big difference between experiencing bipolar symptoms, which would be depression, mania, psychosis, extreme anxiety, hypomania, these types of things. There's a big difference between experiencing those almost biological problems and also dealing with the psychological side of having a mental illness. So I'll give you an example of this to make it clearer. When I'm stable, I'm not suffering from the biological impact of bipolar. I'm not depressed, I'm not manic. However, at various times in the past, I have suffered from the psychological side of bipolar, which would be things like feeling guilty for crazy stuff I've done during an episode, feeling resentful for not having the career I wanted, not having the health that I wanted, not fulfilling some of the dreams that I had when I was younger. I might experience anger and resentment. For me, a big part of that was being resentful and angry at people who had given me bad advice. And this is kind of the psychological side of having a mental illness. And it's interesting because I see from my experience, I see that often they require this biological and this psychological side of bipolar. They require very different approaches to deal with them. For example, I can't even address the psychological challenges of bipolar when I'm depressed or when I'm manic. It's like I'm taken by the illness, and all I can really do is try and look after myself, try to get through that episode, get the help I need, and get back to some kind of stability. But when I'm stable, and it's almost like when I'm stable, I'm able to create a bit of distance between me and the illness. During an episode, the illness is here. It's completely taken me, and I'm getting through. When I'm stable, it's like I'm able to move myself further away from it and look at myself and look at the illness and look at my desires and my dreams, look at what I think I can do, what I can't do. And at that stage of the sort of psychological addressing of bipolar, that's when I think it's really important to be as kind of balanced and steady as we can be, not to be too dragged into the fact that we have this illness and it's a huge issue, kind of the drama of the illness. If we don't want to be dragged into that. It's also a time when I have found psychological help really useful. So I had psychotherapy for about 4 years, and my psychotherapist was fantastic. She was absolutely brilliant. And she very much helped me deal with the psychological side of bipolar. She couldn't stop the biological imbalances, the chemical imbalance, whatever you want to call it. She couldn't really do anything about that. I was taking medication to do that. But what she could do was she could address my issues with bipolar. She could help me move through my regrets, my anger at having wasted so much of my life and not got enough of what I wanted, and all those almost visceral feelings that came to me from being knocked absolutely sideways by manic and depressive episodes when I was only 17. But it was so cool to have that psychological input. And I don't think it necessarily needs to be a psychologist who does it. I think if one finds a good counsellor, if one finds good peer support groups, I think there are different ways to do it. But to actually spend a bit of time looking into how bipolar has affected us and what are we going to do about it? Are we going to see ourselves as a victim of bipolar? Are we going to see bipolar as this huge challenge that we're going to try and make the best of? Are we going to see it as a hopeless situation? Or are we going to try and build more resilience, more strength, to sort of grow somehow from it? And I found therapy, psychotherapy as it was, I found it really helpful for that. And one of the things that it did that has hugely helped me is it allowed me to be more gentle on myself. It taught me, or allowed me to learn, how to be kinder to myself. Because I was super hard on myself for most of my life. I was a real perfectionist. And I think being a perfectionist was a significant part of getting ill, of developing bipolar, because I remember as a kid, I was so hard on myself and I couldn't relax, and I always had to be the best at whatever I thought I could be the best at. And I'd push myself and I'd push myself. There's one story which, well, it might make you laugh, it might not make you laugh. I have to say I laugh about it now because I feel more relaxed about it. But when I was, I think about 12, I was wrestling with a friend in a field in Scotland, and he threw me up and down on the floor. I was pretty tiny for my age, and I usually came off worst when I was wrestling. And I broke my collarbone, and it really hurt. And obviously got taken to hospital. My dad took me to hospital. I got patched up. They put one of these like cross bandages over me, and I imagine they gave me some painkillers. I can't remember that, but I'm sure they must have done. And they sent me home, and they said, look, stay at home for at least a week, because you want this thing to start mending, and you need to look after yourself, you need to rest. But as soon as we were on the car on the way home, and obviously the painkillers had probably kicked in, so I was feeling a bit better, I was desperate to get back to school the next day because we had exams. And I basically always came top of exams. It was like one of the areas that I could just do. I had this super fast bipolar mind, and it helped a lot with exams, And I said to my parents when I got home, I've got to go to the exams, because I was so worried about this very nice girl called Abigail beating me in the exams, because we were all sort of vying for first and second place in our class. And I could not bear the thought of not being top of the class. Now, when I look back now at that experience, I do laugh because it's so ridiculous. And it's such an example of someone who was just really high strung. And this happened 5 years before I had my first bipolar episode. So you can sort of see that in many ways it was on the cards for me to develop a mental illness, because I was so uptight and so high strung and so easily stressed. And another thing that has really helped me with the psychological side of bipolar has been the Ashi's Ascension meditation, which is a meditation that I've taught for the last 20 years and practiced for the last 23 years. And what it's allowed me to do when I'm stable is it's allowed me to develop a completely different relationship with my mind. And it's allowed me to initially just sort of let thoughts just come and go. And it's also got me in touch with this sort of quiet presence that exists within all of us, that is very sort of soft and stable and present. And the more that sort of presence has grown in me, the easier it is to see the sort of the psychological habits that I have that cause me suffering. So for example, that perfectionism that I talked about earlier, I used to be a complete victim to that. I couldn't stop myself being a perfectionist. It got hold of me. It was part of my personality as far as I was concerned. It was just the way I was. But as I became more peaceful through meditating, through the Ashi's Ascension, I started to see when my mind would go into the perfectionism and start worrying, oh my God, you're not good enough, you've got to be better, you've got to keep trying, you've got to push yourself. And I was able to just let go of those thoughts more and more, and let go of almost the visceral feeling in my stomach that had to sort of drive me forward. And so over time, I became less and less perfectionistic. Now, this didn't necessarily affect the underlying biology of bipolar, but as far as the psychological suffering from it, when I combined the psychotherapy and the meditation, it's put me in a much, much better place than I would have otherwise been if I just dealt with the biological side. And that, generally speaking, would have been with medication and also the ketogenic diet. That changes the biology of our brain as well. So for me, I've sort of got myself into this place, or I found myself in this place where I've addressed and I'm addressing the psychological side of bipolar. You know, I'm not ignoring the emotional aspects of it, my relationship to it, but I'm also addressing the biological side. And I do that through taking a relatively low dose of lithium and using the ketogenic diet and various other strategies, such as keeping my stress as low as possible, trying to sleep as well as I can, you know, things like that. But I think it's super important to actually step back and say, okay, I need to look at the disappointments that I've experienced due to mental illness, the guilt I feel about some of the things I've done or haven't done. You know, maybe I've disappointed people in relationships, but it seems like we can't avoid the fact that our journey in life, it is our journey, and it's our experience, and it's our approach that makes a difference. If you want to see any of my videos on the 5 stages of bipolar mindset, then got a couple of them coming up here, and you can click on them. And have a lovely day and look after yourself. Cheerio.